Hold on to your butts.
Welcome to episode 52 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. As always, I'm joined by a woman who, in this case, will be the second most infamous Mary on this episode. And I am, as always, Jess Darren. Hey, Mary, how are you?
You're not just Darren. And, well, hey, I kind of like that. Second most infamous. That's...
In this case, that doesn't say a lot.
I will carry that, though. I will definitely carry that. Well, here we are at episode 52.
52, that's a long time. That's a long time for anything. But this is a special episode today, Mary. For one, it's about our first year anniversary episode.
It is, yes.
And we're going to make a special episode. So we are going to have a special guest today. And we've been talking for many times about John Wilkes Booth and the Lincoln Conspiracy. And we decided to bring in one of our friends who we consider one of the experts on the subject, the Lincoln Conspiracy. And that is, of course, the great Dave Taylor. How are you, Dave?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, and happy 1 year anniversary.
Thank you. Yes, that was a little surprise for you that you are 1 year anniversary.
Yeah, I feel like I just walked into a grocery store and you're like, you're our 100th customer and you get something. So
well, the first anniversary is the Dave anniversary, so we have to make that's.
Oh yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That is.
You get to nerd out with us tonight.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And I didn't get you anything. I'm so sorry.
Oh, your presence is your presence.
That's good. Darren always a sweetheart.
Ooh, yeah, absolutely. Well, it is an honor to have you on. It's great. We've wanted to talk to you for a while about this. We've wanted to talk about this subject for a long, long time. We're going to talk about the Lincoln Conspirators, and we're going to give John Wilkes Booth the night off. He's been run through the mud a little bit, so we're going to leave him off the subject.
Nice with the mud.
See
the
that?
Puns,
Nice.
The puns.
But we're going to talk to the other guys. Now, as we know, we're going to real briefly talk. There were 9 put on trial. We're not going to talk about Michael Laughlin, Samuel Mudd, Edwin Spangler, Samuel Arnold, or John Surratt Jr. We're going to talk about the 4 who were tried and executed. That would, of course, be David Herold, George Atzerodt, Lewis Powell / Payne, but he'll always be Powell to me, and, of course, Mary Surratt. So let's have some fun talking about that. And Dave has been around the block a little bit with this. He's spoken at the Springfield Museum, the Lincoln Museum, and he does a lot of the Booth escape tours. So he's someone who is definitely A-list person when it comes to this this subject. So again, welcome, and we'll have some fun tonight talking about the old gang.
Oh, absolutely. They had so much fun they just died laughing.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not laughing exactly.
Caught hanging around.
There it is.
Another pun.
We need the drum to dun dun. How you don't already have the rim shot.
I'm at the end of my rope with these jokes.
Oh my, that's enough.
I will not be denied.
Oh, I was just about to make a nod joke.
Okay. We'll let that go.
It's painful.
Ooh, it's Lewis painful.
How did this last a whole year?
Painful.
I don't have any. You didn't tell me I had to prepare puns.
Just briefly, how did you get into the Lincoln assassination and studying all things to do with it?
So I grew up in Illinois, and so Lincoln is everywhere. So I was the strange kid when growing up in the land of Lincoln who was like, oh yeah, cool, Lincoln. But how did he die? Okay, tell me more about what happened there. Just because it's so crazy to me that someone could kill who in Illinois is, revered as our country's greatest president. And so how anyone could want to murder him. And so I just started doing research, kind of not research as a kid, just reading. And then when I was in high school, I was a drama nerd. So shout out to all you musical lovers. And I was introduced to the musical Assassins by Stephen Sondheim, which is a very strange musical, but it is about presidential assassins. And John Wilkes Booth is in that, along with the other assassins, and both successful and attempted. And then that is what kind of bridged the gap from when I was really into musical theater and then getting me back into history. And then I just started reading about John Wilkes Booth and the plot, and then just learning more about the guys we're going to talk about tonight, and just realizing it was far more complex than I ever thought. And I've just been reading and writing and speaking about it in my free time ever since. I just find it fascinating. And I know Darren does too, kind of the same basic story. It just bites you when you're young.
Mm-hmm.
So in your drama days, do you ever find yourself calling anybody a sock-doggling old man trap?
Absolutely. And nobody understood what I was talking about. Crickets. It was the biggest joke back in 1865, and crickets now. Uncultured swine. That's what we're dealing with today.
Well, I think you were in good company with us, because as we were talking about before we started recording this, it was the assassination that got Darren and I into this whole Civil War obsession, and I guess ultimately what led to us doing this podcast together. So we are very, very happy to have you on here to join us to talk to us about this. And
I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. So again, we talk about we're going to talk about the 4 guys who 3 men and 1 woman will pay the ultimate price for following John Wilkes Booth down the primrose path to the gallows is what they really did. And so we'll start with David Herold. Now, David Herold, as we know, born in 1842 in Washington, D.C., 7 sisters, 3 brothers who all died when they were infants. So he was the only boy growing up in a house full of women, which must have been awesome in a lot of different ways. But it was kind of a good upper middle class family. His father owned a bunch of properties in the area, some in Baltimore, some in Washington. But he was a very impressionable kid. He was somebody who was quite witty. He was somebody who liked to hang with the popular kids. He was popular, and somebody who I think was someone who would have been easy to manipulate because he was so into wanting to be, I don't want to say accepted, but he wanted to be in that inner circle. I think that was a big part of his childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I think that, you played exactly when people talk about, Booth's impact on these people who we're going to talk about tonight. And Davy falls into the, Booth was this, he's this world famous actor. He is just, it's hard for us to imagine because we see him now as just the villain. And it's so easy sometimes to just put him as, he was the bad Booth. He wasn't as good an actor as his brother Edwin. His brother Edwin also got to perform for decades after because he didn't kill the president and die. And so Edwin was very good. But, when Edwin was 26 and he was good, but so was John Wilkes. So we always kind of, I think we detach Booth from who he was then in 1864, 1865 before his crime, and we associate what he is now with this almost stereotypical characteristic like arch-villain twiddling his mustache and plotting the death of Lincoln. To Davy and to these other people who we're going to talk about, like he was just this worldly, educated, famous, talented person. He had that magnetism around him that Davy especially was drawn to. And as you said, Darren, being the only boy and with 7 sisters, and then his father dies in 1863. He is the man of the house, 2 years before all this with the assassination, that having this worldly, slightly older man, like kind of be this person who takes an interest in you had a huge impact on him.
I was going to say, for whatever reason, people think of David Herold, you think of maybe he was not quite all there. There was something missing. And it's tough to say because of his personality. But reportedly, his father left him out of the will, basically, and that he didn't want him in no way in charge of the family finances after he died, which probably speaks a lot to what he was. Reportedly, he meets John Wilkes Booth in April of 1863 during his performance of The Marble Heart, which reportedly is the same performance a couple days away as when he met Tad Lincoln. And that's the story. And met him backstage. He must have been just completely starstruck. Had to have been. And to your point, Dave, knowing a superstar like Booth, he got to know him a little bit, ran into him off and on here and there. It must have been a situation where a manipulative type of guy, it must have been a moth to a flame for a guy like Booth later on.
Well, I think it's kind of like you have to think of a really famous actor today. And that's how I try and explain the assassination sometimes to people. It's like, it would be like, I've sometimes said Leonardo DiCaprio. That's what it would have been like. These people were hanging out with, as you think of a famous actor. For some reason, I always think of Leo. I don't know why, but I just do. And this is
Leo could do it. Yeah. Let's make a new biopic, and Leo can be Booth. He's a little old, but he can do it. He can do anything.
Like it's like Leonardo DiCaprio is hanging out with these guys. So of course you're going to be starstruck, and that's how I kind of put it to people this time. Like imagine one of the most well-known famous actors and he's killed the president. But then think of it in the context of imagine these people who are hanging out with him and he's bringing them into this conspiracy, and he's very manipulative with them. He's able to latch on to certain parts of their personalities and draw them in. Like I said, Leonardo DiCaprio is what it would have been like. They were hanging out with.
Yeah, and everyone wanted to have something to do with him. Like, why wouldn't you?
Yeah,
of course,
exactly.
if I could be friends with Leo, I'd be friends with Leo.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially, he gets to know him quite a bit. He meets him a couple of times off and on. Again, this is all, reportedly, because the best thing we were saying before, the best thing about the Lincoln conspiracy is the stories, and whether they're true or not, they're stories. And you talk about them, and some might be true, some might be not. But because of the fact that most of the primary sources got destroyed by whoever had them for fear of incrimination, we're left with basically wives' tales, and that's kind of what it is. But allegedly, this is a guy who, as a clerk at a farm, he went to school for pharmacology. I think it was Georgetown he went to.
Yep.
I believe.
Yes. Yep.
Their story is he delivered castor oil to the White House to President Lincoln. So, I don't know what's going on with old Abe, but Dave Herold to the rescue, I suppose.
Maybe it was for Mary.
I don't know. Maybe. But
Didn't do her
you
much
know,
good. I'm just kidding.
It did not. Yet another Mary.
Yeah.
That's
There's
three.
something about the Marys.
Yeah, there is.
There's a movie called. They should make a movie called something.
That's
about
a good
Mary.
idea.
That's a damn good idea. But fast forward, fall of 1864 is when Herold is going to meet Booth again in Washington D.C. And this is when allegedly Booth tries to get him into his plot, into his conspiracy to go ahead and kidnap him. And the story again, real quick, is the prisoner exchange program had been eliminated. It was called the Dix Hill Cartel, and this is a situation where you were trading prisoners during the Civil War. And for many reasons, there was a Fort Pillow massacre with Nathan Bedford Forrest. It got halted by Lincoln. So the plan was, well, if we can get this exchange program going again, we can get some of our guys back. Now, the rebels refused to exchange black soldiers and white officers, and that was a big problem with it as well. Lincoln had that thing, General Order 100, what was called the Lieber Code, which was basically demanded that all soldiers, black or white, were supposed to be treated the same. And that was not going to fly with the Rebs. So Booth's thinking as well, if we can kidnap Lincoln, we can hold him for a king's ransom and at least get the exchange program open again. That seems to be the most common thinking of why the conspiracy plot to kidnap him existed.
Yeah, that's what he tells these people early on. Like the other people were not talking about because they were just involved in this abduction plot. It was a little harebrained, even to their opinions. About being like, I don't know if this is really reasonable, but if we can do it, yeah, it would be great, sort of thing. And I think Davy, being as young as he is, 22 years old, I think at this point, and he's got this actor who's telling him, I have this idea. It can bring us fame because we'll be heroes to the Confederacy. It can bring us fortune because the idea is perhaps the Confederate government would of course pay handsomely for an abducted Abraham Lincoln. And you can be part of this adventure with me. It really drew in Davy, who, though he was, he was a young man at that point, he was described as being boyish. He wanted adventure. He was missing a father figure, even though Booth wasn't old enough to be his father, but still was, I think, wanting that in his life. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions with Davy is that, as you pointed out, Darren, that there is this idea that he was maybe not all there.
Agreed.
That he was
I was thinking that last
you
night.
get it
I was
everywhere.
reading about that. I'm like, this is a kid who, he's a pharmacy clerk. I don't know if that conception of him not being all there is completely true. I think he was just the kid that wanted to be popular. And when somebody like Booth comes along, and Booth is the type of guy that he's bringing people into his inner circle that he is going to benefit from. And Davy, when he was a kid, he would go bird hunting. And because of that, that made him very familiar with the Maryland countryside. That is going to be so beneficial to Booth. So he's looking for this kind of mutually beneficial relationship. Like, how is this going to help me? So obviously, in being the charismatic person he is, Booth is going to come to know Davy and learn this about him. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's going to bring him in. And because he knows that about Davy, he's going to be really, play into what Davy wants, which is to be liked by him.
Those years of going with his father hunting in Maryland, certainly, knowing those back roads heading down that way was going to be appealing, because why else would Booth have anything to do with a guy like that? He's going to play off of whatever he can. Every one of the people we're going to talk about, Booth saw something that he could take from. And for David, it was clearly his knowledge of the countryside. No doubt.
Yeah, and Davy, going back to the idea of him being not all there or whatever, Davy was the most, other than Dr. Mudd, Davy had the most education out of all the conspirators, including Booth. Yep. And so, Davy wasn't that. And the misconception comes because that was the tactic that his defense took at the trial to try to save him. Because Davy was kind of, between a rock and a hard place after the assassination and his capture. He escaped with Booth. I mean, he spent 12 days and only briefly left Booth to then rejoin him back at the Garrett farm. And so, there wasn't a lot of hope for Davy, even though he didn't kill anyone, but with law of conspiracy and everything, he was in a real bad place. And so the best possible defense that they had for him was to play him off as simple-minded and that he was easily manipulated and things like that. And part of that might be true, but I think it's been way overblown in years since. And really, Davy always gets the short end of the stick that, some books play it off as if he's almost mentally retarded.
Yeah, isn't that what they said in Ken Burns?
Yeah, they play him, and I think it's Donald Dow's book about Lincoln, where I think later on he said he didn't know much about the life of like the Lincoln conspirators, especially Davy, and so he made a low life for them. That he didn't, because they're so hard to find research, as Darren pointed out, because some of these people really were nobodies, and that's why too. Booth was a famous actor. We have a lot of people talking about him afterward, but a lot of these other, Davy's a pharmacist clerk. He's 22 years old. There's not much in his life that has happened that's been worth noting, and so we don't have a lot. And so you have this fabrication of all of the conspirators as being just low-life villains because it's easier than actually trying to figure them out.
Yeah, except for the lazy man's route that every one of these guys must have been these guys knuckle-dragging, child-eating monsters, every single one of them. And I think what people, as we talk about these people, it's important to realize the four people we're going to talk about, they had lives, they had families, they had dreams, they had goals, they were religious in a lot of cases. Every one of them followed Booth for different reasons. And whatever they were, as misguided as they might have been, these were not mindless drones. Even Powell, for that part. They were all different, individual, smart-thinking people who chose this route for whatever reason. And I think that gets kind of thrown under the rug a lot. These watching these mafia movies from the 20s are all just these machine gun guys in the backseat firing guns. These are people, every one of them, who, if Booth never came along, they would have been nondescript to history, but they probably would have lived somewhat of a virtuous life, every single one of them.
Yeah, absolutely.
I definitely think so. And I think, like I said about Davy, I think he was, like we were mentioning about Weichman, we probably won't get much into Weichman in the story, but very much the kid that wanted to be popular. Davy had something that Booth needed, and that was knowledge of the Maryland countryside. And he played into that, and he brought Davy into his inner circle. But yeah, I think Davy
also had loyalty.
Exactly.
Out of all the conspirators,
So
as I say,
loyal.
12 days with him, the most loyal, you could be. And I mean, and that is, to anyone else, if David had been that loyal to anyone else, it would have hopefully been a benefit in his life. Unfortunately, he put his loyalty in the one man, he shouldn't have.
Yep, exactly. And it's like, you to wonder kind of, why he's doing that. But I think it goes back to the whole, this is the kid that wanted to be popular, and he's liked by this popular actor. So he's willing to go literally like to the end for this guy.
Whatever it was with Booth, he saw something in Booth that he stuck with, because the night of the assassination, he wasn't very loyal to Powell, right?
No.
I mean, he kind of.
But isn't there stories that he?
Quick.
But isn't there stories that he might not have even been with Powell? That.
Well, again, that's what's great about this is, I mean, whatever the case was, he ended up being focused on Booth, obviously, and to stick with someone, sticking in the woods. And Dave, you and I both spent time in the pine thickets. We know how miserable that can be.
Yeah.
But especially when we weren't being hunted by dogs and cavalry and everybody else.
And a Canadian.
But it takes
a Canadian.
Edward Doherty, chasing them. He probably heard the Anne Murray albums playing, and that's why Doherty was that high.
Here, could I have this dance for the rest of my life playing? And
Here they come.
Like, no.
I smell maple syrup and bad bacon.
And ketchup chips.
Yep. Exactly.
Is that Tim Hortons theme song?
Oh my God, are they eating poutine again?
We need some petrol.
God. But he's an interesting guy. The next guy we're going to talk about is George Atzerodt. Atzerodt's a guy, he's completely different background. This is a guy who was born in 1835 in Prussia. He moved to the United States in 1844 with his family to Baltimore, to a place that's ironically called Germantown, because that's where the Germans were, which is just northwest of Washington. He lived at a farm. But this is a guy who obviously he's one of the hardworking Germans who comes over here. He ends up being a coach maker in Washington with his brother, goes into his brother John, sets up his business out of a place called Port Tobacco, Maryland, which is a great little place right on the Potomac River, by the way.
And he ferries people across during the Civil War.
Well, that's the thing is that, when the Civil War starts, and this is where, John, his brother, ends up taking a job with the Maryland provost. And so he kind of goes one direction, and George left on the other side. So George, he stays in Port Tobacco to keep that carriage business alive. He's got to make some extra money because John's going to basically disappear, and he's going to need to find a way to supplement his money. He gets married. He has a young girl named Edith who shows up. He needs to make some money. So he becomes a rebel smuggler for some extra money. And this is going to be, why would Booth be interested in him? Well, this is the reason why. He's going to find a way to ferry supplies and mail across the Potomac through the Union lines and be very, very good at it. He's going to be a carriage maker by day and smuggler by night. How's that for a LinkedIn resume right there?
He's also the only, I think he's the only immigrant, and he's not an American citizen either that's involved with the conspiracy.
No, and he ends up meeting John Surratt, down in that area, who pulls him into Booth's plot. They hire George to obviously get across the Potomac as part of that Confederate underground. So he's an interesting guy too, because he's an immigrant, and his motivation, it seems anyway, is clearly financial. Clearly.
Absolutely. I mean, again, that fame and fortune, he didn't care about the fame so much, but the fortune, the idea that all I have to do is do what I already do kind of as a pastime, this time just with Lincoln, and I will get a huge payday. Fine. Like, that sounds great to me. He's Confederate in his leanings, but it's funny. I see George as kind of like he would, if it was reversed, if he hadn't lived in Southern Maryland and he was somewhere else where he was, I don't know, if he was in the South and there was Union people there who were paying him to do something clandestine for them, I think George 100% would have done that.
Oh, I agree completely.
You could have bought his sympathies for whatever you wanted.
I agree.
So picture you're a carriage maker, you're German, and there's not a lot of real strong sentiment towards foreigners in this country. Thank God that's changed. But especially in the Civil War with Germans, right? Especially, here comes John Surratt offering you an opportunity to make a lot of money. And to your point, Dave, I already do this. What's the big deal? I've got a baby. I've got a wife. My brother just took off. I can't run this carriage company on my own. The Civil War basically kind of really screwed that up. So of course he's going to agree. The thing about old George, though, was his plan. He was going to wait at Port Tobacco and then to get ferry Lincoln across. He was never even supposed to go to Washington. He was just supposed to stay down there, and the whole thing kind of went off kilter once the whole thing went on.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was just like, it was just another job. And this, I mean, there's other people in this. The story is that in Southern Maryland, everyone knew about Booth's abduction plot. That it was the worst kept secret. Like, the story down there is like, everybody, you go down there and you find people who've lived there for generations and be like, oh yeah, we heard mumblings that there was going to be a kidnapping of Lincoln who was going to come through here. And so, everyone, and they were all Confederate sympathizers down there. So it was just like, yeah, sure. And, one of the other gentlemen who plays into the escape, but later on, Thomas Harbin, who is introduced to Booth by Dr. Mudd and everything, kind of does the same thing where Booth's like, hey, I'm going to kidnap Lincoln, bring him down here. Will you help me? And he's like, well, if you bring him down here, sure, because I'm already doing these underground Confederate activities. And George kind of just fell in the same way with the promise of a payday. But I do, I find it interesting, as we know later on, George is the one who just confesses all the time. Once the arrests happen, he's hoping to not get in trouble if he just becomes state's witness. So he's saying everything, which makes him somewhat unreliable, but also the best source we have, because he just names names and just lays it out to anyone who wants to, including his brother, later on. And I just like how he talks about how, well, the first place he met John Wilkes Booth, though, was at Mary Surratt's. That, John Surratt came down to hire him, and he was like, oh yeah, I guess so. But then George goes up to Washington to meet Booth personally, and it happens in the parlor of the Surratt boarding house.
It does. And what we don't know if they sang karaoke, Mary. Well,
right
there.
Did they sing "Call Me Maybe"?
Very well could have. Maybe a little, of Wiedersehen, or that song is. Maybe they did a little song. But he ends up in Washington, and he's gonna end up taking Booth and Herold down to Port Tobacco to show them the boat that they're gonna be using. Right? This is the boat that John Surratt had basically bought. We'll talk about guys like Richard Smoot and those guys later on. But his plan for that point was just utilitarian. He was gonna be a tool. It's a wrench. They're going to bring him down here. I'm going to get them across. I'm going to get paid, and that's going to be it. And the sad part about old George here was, as this whole thing went on, when he says later on that he didn't sign on for the assassination, I tend to believe him. I really do.
I do too.
And the thing about it, though, is he was a guy who really did whatever he could to turn state's evidence at this trial. All the prosecutors did was just say, okay, and then use other people to corroborate that, and then screw them. Is kind of what they did.
Oh, yeah.
So it was unfortunate for him. I wish in the Conspirator movie that they maybe did a little more into him, because I think he's such an interesting character.
He's an interesting one. He's the one after Mary Surratt that I like to study. And I guess, my one image of him that I have is in the Killing Lincoln documentary that National Geographic did, where he's sitting there in that hotel or wherever they are with Booth. And he said, I signed up for kidnapping, not killing. And it was just like, when I saw that, it really, hit me again. I'm like, wow, maybe this guy really did not, they're dragging him in this more and more. And like, you see Booth in the camera flips to Booth, and he's like, you're in this and you're not getting out at all. And that just shows you, like, again, it goes back to how manipulative Booth could be, that he knows he's got George. George, I think at that point knows he can't get out of this.
Yeah, he's blackmailed, for lack of a better word, because even after, so this abduction plot isn't taking place. They bring George in like January of 65.
Yeah.
And then by then the whole entire plan that Booth had started, in the fall was about kidnapping Lincoln when he was going to the soldiers' home, which he's not doing in the middle of winter now. And so George then just ends up kind of hanging around, and Booth is paying for some of his expenses in Washington and things like that. And so he's just waiting for this thing to happen or not. Either way, he's getting, his accommodations paid for by this famous actor. And then when, it turns and suddenly it's April, and suddenly Booth on April 13th is like, hey, tomorrow I'm going to kill the president, and Lewis Powell's going to kill, Secretary of State, and you, George, you're going to kill the vice president. That's when George suddenly is like, wait a minute.
Nope.
All these things I've done these last few months where I've been taking care of Booth's horses or sharing them or like looking to sell them or like interacting with him and all these people. Now I've realized I've just completely incriminated myself in all of this. I agree that I don't think George ever had any inkling it was going to be assassination until Booth already had him roped into it regardless.
Yeah, and he was told him, he's like, by the way, you're going to go kill the vice president.
Yeah, he even says at one point when he says, I'm not going to do it, George, again, we can only trust what George says.
Yeah.
But in one of his confessions, he said he balked and said, I won't do it. That's when Booth says, well, then maybe Davy will do it, but what will become of you? And so he had George wrapped around his finger. And, in a lot of documentaries and stuff, they say, well, on the night of the assassination, Booth, shoots Lincoln, Powell stabs Surratt, and George Atzerodt gets drunk. And I've done it for the laugh before too. Yeah. But really, I think instead of taking it as cowardice, I think it's his conscience that he didn't want to do it. He couldn't bring himself to do it because I don't think he, first of all, believed in murder. And he especially, even though he'd been blackmailed into it, he still wasn't going to pull the trigger for Booth.
Yeah, there's just something, I don't know. I've always seen George as being that way, not in it for, because he's just finding out about this,
it's not his cause.
24 hours before he's supposed to do it. He's like, what? I've been told I'm supposed to do this, and now you're telling me I have to do this?
He did hang around that Kirkland house, though. That's the
thing. Checked in. He followed Booth's orders.
He didn't make a run for it. So Booth at that point was a spider, and you got in the web, and you were stuck, and that was it. He hung around, and even according to the Whiteman book, he could have ran, but he didn't. So I don't know if he was vacillating, but I don't think there was ever a situation where he was actually going to go through with that. I don't think it was ever going to happen.
And Booth realized that too. We were talking about Davy and Darren's point about how he bailed on Powell, and Mary, you brought up in Michael Kaufman's book. There's very little evidence, concrete evidence, that Davy went with Powell to Seward's house. Mm-hmm. There is only an article that came out in a newspaper, if I'm remembering correctly, a few days after the assassination that said that he was the lead, but we don't have a source. I don't think we have a good source for that, where it came from. And I think there's good evidence that part of George's confessions are accurate, that I think Booth, seeing that George was faltering and even the blackmail may not be enough, really Kaufman puts out there that Davy was supposed to be the point man, that maybe he led Powell to Seward's, but then he deliberately left, not worrying about chaos or any of that stuff, but to go check on George, and to maybe the two of them together were going to make an attempt on the vice president. But at that point, George had abandoned the Kirkwood, locked the door, and left. And that's why Davy didn't have any other choice other than get on his own horse and escape after Booth.
What is that story where people heard the pounding on the door? It's likely Davy knocking on the door. And
the wife of the hotel keeper said around 10:15, someone was running in the hallway, pounding on the door, and that the assumption is that was Davy looking for George.
And that's again, we to the beginning, that's what's great about these stories, is that you never know. Was it Davy looking for George? Maybe he was the one who, per John Wilkes, make sure he gets there. But again, you never know. So that's probably.
But also, we have all that stuff in George's room that he locked that belonged to Booth.
Yeah, exactly.
And stuff that could have helped him. There was a map in there, and there was Booth's coat along with some money and other things. So the assumption is that Davy, even if he wasn't going to help George, wanted to get that stuff for the escape, but because George had locked it and left, he was stymied and had to just leave. And that's why Booth, we talk about his famous diary, that Booth, just has this because he doesn't have the supplies he was supposed to have on the run. He's got to make do with what he had.
That's why he used a diary of toilet paper, by the way. Just saying.
That's right. Absolutely, he used a diary of toilet paper.
I've been saying that for years. I've been saying that for years.
God.
It's absolutely accurate.
Yeah.
That's the missing. Sorry, Benjamin Gates.
I don't know if he needed that many pages, but he definitely used some of them
for
toilet paper.
Absolutely.
You better the Surratt boarding house? You better the restaurant?
I've never had problems with their sushi.
In any case, but you could say all you want about Atzerodt, but I think he's kind of the helpless victim in this whole thing, where he got pulled into it for financial reasons. He had to support a family. He had a brother who left him the business, basically the founder. The Civil War took care of that. He had to find his way. Doesn't justify what he did, but you can see the wheels in his mind going. I just got to do what I've been doing, and I'm going to get a bunch of money. Why wouldn't I?
Yeah, exactly.
I think the hope was it wasn't going to happen too, because I mean, he's the one, he doesn't attack the vice president, and then he goes toward Ford's and afterwards and sees the chaos that's going on, and then he doesn't know what to do. He spends, I mean, you think of, if I'm committed, I have an escape plan. He didn't, because I think it really wasn't something he was hoping wouldn't happen. It was a bad dream, and Booth was just being crazy, and that's why he rides the stagecoach, all night, then just goes to a hotel, checks in, leaves early in the morning without paying, and tries to make his way out, because he's like, what do I do now? Because I never thought that this was going to happen.
Yeah, he always thought it was probably just going to be kidnapping, and he finds out April 13th, oh no, it's not. They want me to kill the vice president. Like, where does your mind go as a human? Like, how do you start
what do you do? Because I think Booth was manipulative enough that even if George had straight up said, we talk about, and I've noticed before, like they all of these people we're talking about, I think the reason they paid the ultimate price is because the evidence shows to some degree that they knew what Booth was going to do, and they did nothing to stop it. Some of them actively assisted in it, and some of them, like George, just didn't do anything about it. But at the same time, if I was in the same shoes, what could I do? I mean, you want to feel like I would be the hero. I would go to the Metropolitan Police Force and be like, John Wilkes Booth is going to shoot Lincoln. But at the same time, like, first of all, would they believe you? And Booth had wrapped him around so much in all of this that what repercussions would it be for me? It's not worth the risk if I can somehow just get out of it.
And the other thing too is he is a German immigrant who is not an American citizen. And you look at my favorite corps in the AOP is the 11th Corps. They're primarily German. They don't get treated very well. So there's this kind of on either side, he's not looked upon very highly. So some of that could have factored into it. Like I know Kaufman writes about how he was seen differently from the other conspirators. Like, people would see Booth and Surratt as being very gentleman-like. And then Atzerodt was kind of the awkward guy.
Old plug tobacco.
Yeah, didn't
looked
really
weird and hunched over.
Didn't really fit in with them.
Dirty.
And I think that's kind of the culture, with who he was from, the prejudice against him as a German, as an immigrant, as somebody who's not an American citizen. And I think, when you're looking at George Atzerodt and what has happened to him, what he goes through, like you have to think about that too, that's some of that is factoring into his story as well.
Yeah, it is a lot. Now, before we go on to Powell, this is Powell. We'll take a little quick digression. What do you think the point was really when Booth decided he was going to kill Lincoln?
I think a lot of it was Booth's own vanity. I truly think the war was coming to an end. He saw it, and I don't think he could live with the idea that the war over and everyone coming back as heroes, and the respect that people would have that they fought in the war, even, on both sides, that Booth, he had been kind of, because he was affluent, was able to just piss away the Civil War without having to get his hands dirty. And I think the combination of Booth being a Shakespearean actor who acted out being the savior of the Republic, of being the Brutus who slays the Caesar, and him believing that Lincoln had become a tyrant, combined with the fact that it was already too late to do anything about it. It really was, but Booth maybe thinking that if I want the greatness associated with this great event in which so many people have died and fought and gained honor from, this is what I'm going to do. I think it was almost pure vanity with the idea that it would help the Confederacy, the South would rise. All of that, I think, is just lies Booth told himself to just deal with his ego, that he couldn't deal with the fact that he had plotted something great and had planned all these wonderful things that were going to happen to him, and now it was for nothing. And I need that greatness that I guaranteed myself.
But do you think it kicked in earlier, though? Was my saying? Do you think because there's the story of the Lawn letter, for example? There's a story of the Charles Shelby letter, right? Where some might be urban myth, might be true. The story where someone sent a letter to the National Hotel with all these details of the assassination before, and it was delivered to the wrong room, and Booth never got it. And then, of course, there was the Selby letter, which is the one in 1864, that a woman saw a guy look like Booth. She dropped a letter on the train, and it talked about, and this is the letter that allegedly that really freaked Lincoln out, that he held on to in his desk out of all the assassination letters. This is the one that resonated with him. So do you put any credence on those? And do you think
No.
that there's any truth to that stuff? Because
I mean, there were threats against Lincoln, no doubt. But in terms of them being connected to Booth, like, yeah, one of the first witnesses is Mary Hudspeth in New York, talking about how she found this letter in a gutter on a streetcar. But even then, it wasn't that it was Booth. It was just like, I think the government was just trying to put it, they wanted to put it all together at the trial, to be like, look at how it was the Confederacy. Remember, the whole reason for the trial wasn't really to put those 8 people on trial. It was to put Jefferson Davis, it was to a prelude to Jefferson Davis and all those traitors, and to be like, they are the ones that killed our president. These were the little people who did it, pulled the trigger, helped him out, but they were the ones that did it. And that was just the wrong way to go. And I think that all those letters, that I wish we had a smoking gun really for Booth to directly connect him to Jefferson Davis and the Confederates. But in all of the reading I've done, I've seen hints of it. John Surratt was a Confederate courier. He had involvement with some of these guys, but a direct link, is not there, in my opinion.
it was like it was in a lot of cases, it was like they had the answer to the question and they had to go find the question to let up to the answer. The Selby letter is pretty obvious. They brought in a handwriting expert who swore it was Booth's handwriting, and they did all that stuff that kind of played it. But I think they had the answer and they needed to prove it. And I think that they were going backwards. It just popped in my head because that was a lot of what we're talking about with this stuff. Is a lot of the stuff that is clearly urban legend. Obviously, Booth shot Lincoln, no question. Powell attacked Seward. Everything else, you can make a case of who the hell knows. That's the reality of this, is that there was so much stuff lost and there's so much stories and so many rumors and so many just hearsay that it's fun to talk about because we'll never know. And we'll never know.
I think it definitely was vanity, and just like he's watching the Confederacy die and he didn't expect that. And there's that quote from him, and who knows if it's true, where he's, in the Star Saloon, right? And he said, "When I leave the stage, I will be the most talked about man in America." And that goes back to the vanity, whether that quote is true.
Well, I say that whenever I leave the bar, so it doesn't.
Yeah, I know. Trust me, I know. It's like your tagline.
Oh, we know Darren's drunk. He's talking about being the most famous man in America again.
When I leave the stage, I will be the most.
You're slurring when I leave the stage,
Darren, it's
Mary.
time to go home now.
Did I tell you about the time I left the stage, Mary?
Light my cigar on the lamp. The street.
That scene in Killing Lincoln where he lights the cigar on the lamp. That's classic Booth.
We're going to talk about Lewis Powell now. We're going to talk about Lewis Powell, okay? And I always call him Lewis Powell. We'll talk about how he gets called Payne here in a little bit. But it's always Lewis Powell. That's his name. Born in Alabama, born in 1844. I believe he had 11 brothers and sisters. He had a big family. He ended up moving to Florida when his family's finances kind of went kaput. He's the guy who has real Civil War experience. So he's part of the 2nd Florida. He joins on the end of May 1861. So he joins pretty quick. Ends up fighting at the Siege of Yorktown with Magruder, 1862. He's part of Jubal Early's brigade, Mary. We talk about him a lot. He fights the 2nd Manassas in Antietam, Fredericksburg. But Gettysburg is where he gets all of his chops. So he was shot in the wrist either on the 2nd day as part of Lane's brigade, either on the Pickett's charge or the 2nd day. No one really knows for sure. But he ends up being held at Pennsylvania College, which is Gettysburg College now, which makes me think it was probably on the 3rd day when he was probably shot, because the 2nd day was still held by Confederates. There wouldn't have been a Union prisoner of war camp that day, realistically. But it doesn't matter. He goes there, and to Dave's point earlier, he's got a real knack with medicine for whatever reason. As a child, he would restore animals to health. When he was a kid, he ended up helping a lot with the Confederate wounded. And he ends up meeting a woman named Margaret Branson. And this is a woman who's from Baltimore, and she's a lot of civilians. They came down to the area to help the Confederates. And she takes a shine to Powell. He's going to ultimately get transferred to a hospital, a prisoner of war camp in Baltimore. There's that great story about how she snuck him out of prison. Who knows if that's true, if they put the file.
He escaped with air quotes. He escaped.
But there's that story she bribed the guard with.
She brought him a cloak and brought a cake with a $10 note in it, and that he used the cloak and the $10 to bribe his way out.
It's a great story if that's the case. But regardless, he does get out. She does help him escape. She ends up living in I think it's 16 Utah Street, which is the same road that Camden Yards is on, Mary, by the way, where the Orioles play, just a little bit north of the ballpark. And there's a boarding house there. And he's going to ultimately end up going back to the Confederate Army. He joins Mosby's Rangers, winter of 1863, give or take, in that ballpark. But he's a guy he's young, but he's got a lot of fighting experience. And he's somebody who is a capital C Confederate in the war.
He also survived being kicked by a mule.
Right in the face.
Yep.
When he was a kid.
Yep.
So he's good with animals, but just don't get behind. That's how he learned to be good with animals. One mistake. Exactly. Then you learn. Don't go behind the mule near the legs.
But it's funny because, he ends up staying with them until early 1865, and he ends up leaving his union. What's interesting about him, though, is he's very loyal to the Confederates, but he also walks on his union, and he actually takes the oath of allegiance to the Union and goes back to Baltimore. He ends up back at Brance's boarding house, early 1865. And this is probably when he met John Wilkes Booth, realistically, was up there in Baltimore. There's connections where, he was working at a place in, I believe it was a china shop he was working at. So you could literally say he was a bull in a china shop, Mary. You could literally use that quote to describe him.
So bad.
In this,
We'll just edit that one out.
Oh, thank you so much. Anyway, my little derringer is what I need from you here. But the reality was that allegedly that little shop was a stop on the Confederate Railroad, and that's where John Surratt would have met up with him. And that's a place where he probably would have ended up getting brought into the plot realistically.
And this is January 65. And like you said, at that point, he's already assumed his alias. So in that period of time between when he escaped, after Gettysburg and before he went back and joined Colonel Mosby's Rangers, he spent some time in Warrenton, Fauquier County, Virginia, in a family by the name of the Payne family. And so he's kind of like hanging out with them, befriending them. And there's a guy who's in charge of the home is John Payne. And he's got like a nephew whose name is Lewis Payne. And then kind of from then on, whenever Powell got in trouble, that's when he started using this alias. He kind of stole this kid's identity, which is, I don't know if that's a very classy thing to do, but that's when he signs his oath of allegiance, like you talked about. He does L. Payne and stuff like that. And so that's why, in all the books and everything after the assassination, his identity, he was the mystery man. He really was. And there's a great book by author Betty Owensby called Alias Payne, Lewis Thornton Powell, the Mystery Man, or Lincoln Conspiracy. And because really no one knew who he was. I mean, because he, even after the arrest, he wasn't talking to the authorities. He barely told his lawyer. His lawyer took 2 weeks through, the trial had been going for 2 weeks before finally Powell tells his lawyer his real name and where his family is and everything like that down in Florida. And so he really was, like you said, Darren, he was a Confederate kind of through and through. And he entered this plot of Booth's with this soldier's mentality. The last words of Powell, when they're putting the execution hood and the noose around his neck, and they, the executioner is saying, "I hope you die quick, Payne." Even then, they still call him Payne because they don't know any better. He says, "You know best, Captain." And he still has that military, that soldierly look about it. And that's what he followed Booth as, the same way. He saw Booth as a superior, and this was a cause for, it was played to him as a cause that would benefit the Confederacy. And this was something that he joined first to kidnap. And then even when it switched to assassination, you don't question your orders. Once you've decided, you do what is told to you. And Powell, that's what happened to him.
It was interesting about Powell, too. He showed some cracks in the armor. There's that story where he kind of saved some Union soldiers when he was part of Mosby's partisan Rangers, protect them from a farm they just pillage. And he's an interesting cat in a lot of different ways. But he's certainly somebody who was he was Booth's muscle, and he knew that he was going to be the most loyal guy. He had to have been realistically the only guy Booth probably 100% trusted in the entire thing. And that's kind of what the way it went through. But he, to your point, best, Captain. He was a soldier. That's what he was.
Yeah. And I think that's the huge difference between him and someone like Atzerodt. Atzerodt, when it came down to it, wasn't about to follow an order that was to murder somebody. And Powell, having been a soldier, was.
And that was the defense, Powell's defense attorney, his closing arguments. There wasn't much hope for Powell. I mean, he stabbed the Secretary of State, in the face, and he, broke Frederick Seward's head. A piece of his skull popped out with his gun and stabbed, a bunch of other people. There wasn't much hope, but that is what the defense attorney, William Doster said. He said that it was the South that had turned him into a killer. That it was the war, it was slavery, it was being a Confederate. That you can't blame him for doing what he did because he had been trained, since through the war to become this machine, and Booth just gave him the direction, that he required. And so it was a good attempt to save his client, to condemn the Confederacy in general in the South and the whole, environment that Powell grew up in, to try to save him. But yeah, exactly as Darren said, he was the muscle. And, you said he trusted him the most, when Booth and Herold get to Surratt Tavern and are talking to John M. Lloyd and get their thing. And before they leave, what do they say? They say, "Oh, I have some news if you want to hear it." And Lloyd says, "Whatever, tell me if you want." And Booth says, "I'm pretty sure we have assassinated Lincoln and Secretary Seward." There was even though Seward survived, Booth was confident, and he didn't say the vice president, which I think is very telling, that he had because if Davy, whether he knew or not that Georgia didn't go through with it, Booth wasn't ready to brag that they killed the vice president because he wasn't sure. But when it came to Powell, he knew he could trust Powell to get the job done. And it was only by a miracle that he didn't kill Secretary Seward.
Exactly. Yeah.
At the trial, his attorneys are going to try to soften him a little bit without much. Like this story, allegedly Powell wanted to, apologize to Seward for what he did, and he tried to say that everything against Mary Surratt, she was innocent, and by then the die was cast with that. You don't want to say he was a robot, but he was a trained killer, and he was somebody who, unfortunately, if you're going to do a plot like this, you have to have a guy like that. There's no question.
And the interesting thing too is, I think when Booth read the papers and read about Seward's sons, what had happened to him, he was appalled by it. He was like, "This is not what I asked him to do."
Davey said, he felt bad about the sons.
Yeah, I asked him to go after just Secretary of State, not his kid.
Well, you mentioned before about how he was talking to Lloyd down at Surrattsville. There's those stories where they weren't even sure how the heck the secession was supposed to go. If you kill the vice president, it's not like it is now. The president pro tem, the Senate's the guy who was supposed to take over. A guy named Lafayette Foster was the guy who would have taken over. Mm-hmm. But they didn't even know. And there's that story of Booth was kind of asking a friend of his, like, so not for nothing, who follows him? And the guy just started laughing after a while. He's like,
how do I decapitate the government?
You'll never get that far, But it goes to show, and if you can probably see that once Richmond fell, you can see Booth snapped and decided he was going to, to your point, just out of vanity and to do the whole thing. Before we get to Mary, it's funny talking about the kidnapping plot of how silly the whole thing got to. My favorite story is the one how they were going to shut the lights off and throw Lincoln off the balcony and
at Ford's Theater.
He was going to come right back on again.
David Blaine it. He's gone.
Like he's gone now. Where'd he go?
Allegedly, Edward Spangler was the guy who put the lights out, right? And
that's what they wanted to accuse him of, but I don't.
And then there's that story where when the actual assassination happened, allegedly he couldn't get to the light, and then you had Peanuts holding the horse, and it's so funny because it turned into a Keystone Cops of who was supposed to do what at the end with the whole thing. And when you read the accounts of, because you could read 5 different sources and they're all 5 different stories.
Mm-hmm. They're all George Atzerodt.
I've said many times, Peanuts got screwed. I'm saying that my whole life.
Because he got kicked and hit with a knife.
He got beaten up. He's a poor little guy holding the horse. He gets beaten up. But yeah, there's a lot of that though. But Powell's certainly somebody who he was a soldier right up until the end. To your point, he says best captain. He knew his fate the entire time of the trial. And I thought Norman Reedus did a great job playing him in the movie too. By the way,
yeah, I thought so too.
Didn't have a lot of lines. I wish he had more. But he certainly had the mentality.
The thing I remember about Powell, again, going back to the Killing Lincoln documentary, is just when they're sitting in that hotel room in the initial meeting and he's like, "It's pain. I ain't going by Powell no more." And then Booth is like, "Could you get it straight?" And then they go back to when he's in the shooting gallery and he's like, "It's Powell," or whatever. He says the reverse, and the look on Booth's face, he just rolls his eyes. It's like, could we not? Just could you pick one? Alias?
It must have just been for the audience benefit to know who this guy is. They had to throw it in twice.
That's what I'm thinking. It's like, but just like Booth, like the guy who played Booth, his reaction, he's just rolling his eyes like, okay, could we not keep changing the alias that you have? Because if we get questioned.
Well, and he did, because when he first, came to this Surratt boarding house, he decided to pretend to be a Baptist preacher named Wood. His dad was a Baptist preacher, so it wasn't a bad alias because he knew from his father, what that would look like. But I remember Anna Surratt or Honora Fitzpatrick, one of them, be like, well, that he'd make a queer preacher. I don't know if he's going to convert a lot of souls because he just seemed so out of place. And nowadays, Powell is the poster child. You show pictures of Lewis Powell to people, like I show it to them, and he was a handsome man. You talk about Booth being the handsomest man in America, but if you put Lewis Powell next to him, I'm okay saying it, that Lewis Powell was one handsome dude, and that is, he looks like a Calvin Klein model in his mugshot photographs.
The colorized photos of him, is he the youngest one?
Yes, because I think he has his 21st birthday in prison.
Yep.
Around
he was born 1844,
yeah,
right?
So he's the youngest.
2021, yeah.
Yep.
Okay. We talk about, he's not one-dimensional, just a soldier. The stories about, like you said, him taking care of animals, his family had good memories of him, but at the same time, there was those aspects of rage. One time he got arrested for beating a black servant half to death for disobeying him. Yep. It plays a role that these are complicated people who, as you said, he, even before going to the gallows, was trying to defend Mary, trying to defend a woman. He protected some Union soldiers who had surrendered to him, and people were trying to kill them, and he stood up for them and said, no, you will not kill these men. So there's this very conflicted, just like everybody, where you have all these layers, and it's hard to just judge him as one thing or another, and we shouldn't, because he was a rounded individual with both a lot of positive attributes and obviously a lot of negative attributes as well.
Exactly. Yep. And that's a good segue
Well,
into our last conspirator that we're
we got
going
to
to
talk
talk about,
we
which
got to
is
talk about our girl Mary now.
Mary Surratt.
Drinking from the Mary mug.
Yep.
You got to do it. You got to do it. So Mary Surratt's story, Mary Jenkins. She's somebody who you could do a whole episode on just her. She's the enigma. She's the whole thing, and she's somebody out of all the people back then and now. It's really a polarizing type of person. Whether it's you feel for or you hate her. There just doesn't seem to be much in between. Staunch Southern supporter. She ran the Confederate underground out of her home in Surrattsville. The thing about Mary, though, was that she was widowed at a young age, and she was a strong businesswoman for someone of that period. I mean, she was, people, you had collectors coming to her at property trying to take advantage of her, and she wasn't having it. I always like the fact that she grew up on Andrews Air Force Base. I always got a kick out of that story.
That is cool.
It's just an irony that her family grew up on the land that would become Andrews Air Force Base.
And I think she gets her independence from the fact that her father dies at a young age, and her mother has to.
Right.
She's got to take over this plantation and manage the farm, manage the slaves, and she does it quite well. And she manages to increase the finances that she has. So she's got this really good figure. But the interesting thing about it is, at the end of the story, her mother never has anything to say about the execution of her
mother
daughter.
Outlives her, and we have no documents from her what she said about what happened to her daughter.
Exactly, but you can see how she's influenced by her, because I've always seen Mary Surratt as being somebody who, she goes through hell with her husband John Sr., who is, he's an alcoholic by like 1861, and I think he passes away 1862. She's got her 3 kids, but she's also, as they're growing up with this, she's got to protect them in any way she can from who he is with the tavern, and he's clearly drinking quite a bit. So I see her as being a very independent, strong female figure. Again, it goes back to the other conspirators in this. Like, what do they have in this? Like, what's their stake in this? And hers is the boarding house that she has, which is where they're all gathering,
Well, I mean, that's where John running, smuggling up and down from that area. It's obviously a hotbed of Confederate activity. It's interesting because she moves the family to Washington, D.C. to get away from that whole element. They end up buying the place over there right behind you. You can see her waving from the window, actually, if you look close. Again, she was, quite industrious. But again, she had a little controversy, she had a little trouble with that priest. There was rumors that talk about with him, and who else got sent up to Boston, by the way. And,
Father Fanati came up by you?
Father Fanati, he was sent to Boston. Usually they get sent out of here to somewhere else.
Wow.
They were just friends, Darren.
Absolutely.
He needed a confidant. Her husband was train wreck.
No question about it. But again, I think she was focused on protecting John, protecting Anna.
Yeah.
And Isaac, her other son, was fighting for the Confederacy, and he never saw him again. He ended up living, but never got back to it. Her situation is one that she's very strong Confederate of that area. There's no question about it. She ends up getting pulled into the entire thing because, she ends up having the property, which like I said, right behind you, which ends up being the nest that hatched the
egg roll.
That phrase. Yeah,
according to President Johnson.
The egg roll. You got it.
That's the pun I tell on the booth tour.
Yeah.
Nowadays with the Chinese restaurant, it's the nest that hatched the egg roll.
So someday the 3 of us have to go take a picture outside that restaurant and put that as the caption on Twitter or something like that.
That's right.
So I know you've done a lot of background on Mary back, specifically when she was young. So how do you think her mindset was growing up, specifically from going from Maryland into Washington, D.C., and probably her mindset when she got to D.C.?
I mean, she is, Southern Maryland, like born and bred, and we undercut like Maryland. Maryland has a very complex history when it comes to Civil War, being a border state and just being so reliant on slavery, and how it essentially was forced to stay in the Union, by military act when the secession crisis began. And so Mary is very much a Confederate sympathizer. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we can try to, it's hard for us, I know sometimes, especially some of Mary's defenders talk about, she couldn't be capable of some of these things because let's look at how deeply religious she was, which she absolutely was. She was, she converted to Catholicism, and, she was very religious and went to church all the time. But that, as we know, sometimes the people who proclaim to be the most religious can be, in my mind, sometimes the most sinful. But she had that same thing of being supportive of, slavery. She saw it as a way of life that, needed to continue. She had slaves of her own, even though because of financial circumstances, she was more renting enslaved people from her neighbors. And, she had a rough time after her husband drank himself to death and, was in so much debt that's why she moved to that DC property. And then living there, she moved there, I think, partly to help her children. But at that point, John Surratt was already in it. I mean, he had taken over as postmaster after his father died. And even after they lost the postmaster position, he was then that's when he stopped being a agent in a set place and started being a courier. It's hard to believe, especially during that period of time when he was postmaster before it was revoked from him, and then afterward, that she wasn't aware of some things that he was doing. And that's where the big question of how much did she know? But once John Surratt brings John Wilkes Booth to her home, she does get roped in. And so I don't think it's that Booth never sought Mary out. When we talk about these other conspirators, he sought these people out. Davy, he brought him in. Powell, he definitely sought him out. George was to help with this. Mary, I feel like, that's why it's hard for people to believe in her guilt, is because she's not like, you don't go being like, what I need on this A team? A widowed mother living in DC. That's what I need.
Owns a boarding house.
Owns a boarding house. That's what I need. No, it was just when John Surratt was no longer there, because he's doing these courier activities for the Confederacy, and Booth is still trying to keep his own kind of weird plan together, and Mary allows him to use that space and is his go-between between John Surratt and himself. That's what gets her into this. And she was never going to play an active role. She just kind of got one because she had to play that middleman, and that's what kind of works against her.
I mean, a lot works against her too, because you had people like Sarah Slater at that place all the time. She was always there. I always go back to the fact that it's like, well, if I was going to do a really bad crime, would I tell my friend's mother? And that's where I always kind of fall back on too. But again, she clearly knew about the kidnapping plot. She had to have. Mm-hmm. Whether or not she knew about the assassination, it's tough to say. The two damning pieces against Mary, if we're going to go try to damn her, was the fact that she had allegedly reserved a room for Powell at the Herndon House in March. She was part of that. And the Smoot story is the one that gets you. That's the one that gets her, right? So the story where the night of the assassination, Richard Smoot was the guy who owned the boat down at Port Tobacco. I guess Surratt had only paid for half of it, because that's what he was going to do. Take off, you only pay half, you might as well save some money. He comes knocking on the door the night of the assassination looking for the money. And I guess Mary is like, you need to go because they're going to use it today. I could be wrong, but I don't think that story came out till after.
Yes, it was quite a bit after that Smoot finally told that story. Yeah.
So that adds a little bit of credence to the fact that she knew something was going down that night, whether or not it was the assassination or not. And then there's the story, the Weichman story about, like you referenced earlier, about when they were coming back from Clinton or Surrattsville, that all this happiness will be turning to gloom. And she was asking about when the soldiers' sentries leave their posts. And there's all those little stories that, again, it's all hearsay. If I'm going to hang my hat on Mary being guilty, it's the Smoot story, because that's the one that there's really no explanation for.
That she used those words. And that's the thing with Mary. It's funny how we have all these small pieces. And, the problem about Mary is that you have the witnesses where we really put the evidence on are unreliable witnesses. I tend to believe most of what Louis Weichman says on the stand, the boarder who testified about Booth being there. And because we have other witnesses who verified that, and that, he would have conversations with Mary when John Surratt was out and things like that. And I tend to also believe John M. Lloyd at Surrattsville Tavern, who's, when he says that when Mary came that day, that she told him to have the shooting irons ready. Someone's going to call for them tonight. And so but those witnesses also, we have to question them, because Lloyd is told the night of the assassination, I think we just shot Lincoln and we killed the Secretary of State. And then Lloyd goes to sleep. He's just like, all right, well, have fun with that. Bye. And, Weichman, as Mary alluded to earlier with Davy Herold, is the kid who wants to be involved, and Booth manipulates him too. He gets Weichman wrapped in this as well, like doing things for him, telling, I think there's a telegram that John Wilkes Booth sends to Louis Weichman saying, give me the address of Powell, at the Herndon House, or whatever you're saying, that Booth is trying to wrap him into this as well. And that's where it gets complicated. Where do we put our trust when we have these pretty damning statements from these guys, but they themselves are also very questionable?
Yeah, the Lloyd story, because it took him a little bit of time to come around to that story. I think he had a little time in Capitol Prison. Then he finally woke up and said, well, I better tell this story. Yeah. So again, a lot of this, it goes back to covering your own skin with a lot of this stuff. And my whole thing with her was, there's no way she's completely innocent. It's just you have to really, really, really stretch it out. My Mary Surratt glass notwithstanding, she clearly knew something. Whether or not she knew about the assassination, is it possible she still thought there could have been some sort of kidnapping plot I suppose they had nowhere to take him, though. That's the other thing too.
Yeah.
You know, like Booth was talking a lot about how Joseph Johnson was going to be going to the mountains and he was going to be fighting a guerrilla war, and maybe he was going to take him there, and who knows, maybe they were going to go to Eden, Oklahoma, maybe, who knows that.
Popular place.
Exactly. We're gonna hit Granbury first, and we're gonna go to Enid. We're gonna get you there. You wonder too, because you know how much John Surratt were they holding her basically bait for John to come back to?
I think in some ways they were.
But then there was these reports that John Surratt was seen in Washington that night too, which ended up not being true. So you wonder how much they really knew. The night of the 14th of April, I always equated to what 9/11 was like here, where all these rumors, all these stories. You know, you're hearing horses running through the streets as rumors there's the Confederate cavalry and coming back, and so you can imagine the sheer mayhem and all the stories that came out of that, and all the different urban legends that we still deal with today.
I do think, she was kind of held for like to bring her son out of where he was, which was in Canada.
Those darn Canadians
hiding up in Montreal, and he never shows up. He never.
I think that was definitely a part of it, but also they had enough to hold her. I think they wanted. They did have enough to hold her. They wanted John Surratt, but it wasn't. That sometimes I feel like people, and not that you were doing it, but there are some people make the argument that Mary was innocent. They just wanted John. I'll be like, well, they wanted John, but also look at what they had on her.
They had enough to have her, but they also wanted John, and I think they were playing into that, like, he's her son, so he's gonna come be the good son and save her.
I'm not sure if he could have, though, to be honest.
No,
I think if John Surratt would have come back, I think they would have added him to add a chair.
I think so.
But then I think they still would have the evidence against Mary, and maybe just because they might get worried about executing a woman. But really, I always look at too, like, Mary was, in their eyes, Mary was guilty. Like, really, I mean, you look at the final votes, we don't have the exact vote counts, but they found her guilty, and they found 2/3 majority decided that she should be executed. And yes, you have a clemency plea where they say, but the clemency plea isn't, we think she's innocent. It's, she's guilty. We have established beyond a reasonable doubt that she's guilty, and not only guilty, but deserving to be executed. So you voted twice for each one of the conspirators when they were deciding the guilt and then sentencing. They did 2 votes for each conspirator. Are they guilty? You just needed a majority vote to be found guilty. And then should they be executed? Then you needed 2/3. So we don't know exact vote counts, but still, she was found guilty, and enough people, at least 6 out of the 9 commissioners, says she should be executed based on the evidence. And then even though 5 of them wrote a clemency plea, it wasn't because we think she's innocent, it's because she's a woman and her age. It was more chivalry that made them do it, not any question of her guilt. And it really, up until the point where she was hanging by the end of that rope, people were saying, look at this evidence. It was only because, and it's interesting how that plays into the dynamic of Victorian womanhood and masculinity and chivalry and stuff like that, how she was capable of it all during the trial when we have all this evidence. But then the second we punish her in the same way that we would punish a man for this, then we have done something wrong, that there's something wrong with society. She is a woman. How could we have done that? And it's interesting how it plays into just these bigger ideas.
I think it's the PR, because it went from hang her to, oh my God, we can't possibly hang her, almost overnight, right?
Yeah.
And you look at the 9 guys, Hunter and Couts and Howard, Aiken and Clinton and Wallace and Foster and Tompkins and Harris, all the 9 of them, right?
Wow, way to go, buddy.
Right. So
I could not do that if you asked me to.
So you have 9 of them. You probably had 6 was going to hang because it's majority, it was 2/3 and 5. So you have to wonder, out of the 5 people who, we have no idea who the 5 were, who were looking for clemency.
No, we know the 5 who signed it.
We do?
Yeah, because the clemency plea was signed by 5 of them. I don't know at the top of my head who they were, but we don't know. And that's the thing. You needed at least 2/3. They all could have voted to execute her, and we just don't know. And it just had to be at least 6 out of the 9.
But even the executioner said that he just put 5 knots in because he didn't think that she was going to be executed. And he was, and
you have the same ideas of chivalry. That's why, exactly. Yeah. And like Lewis Powell, we talked about him saying, Mary Surratt had nothing to do with it. That is an example of that chivalry, because I'll tell you right now, Davy Herold said she's in deep in it as the rest of us. So, sometimes people like to point out, be like, well, look, Lewis Powell, he on the at the scaffold said she was innocent. Davy was complaining at one point during the trial when she was getting sympathetic treatment. He was like, that old lady was in it as deep as the rest of us. So, the idea of Davy, I can believe that, because he definitely doesn't take me as the one to be the chivalrous type, while Powell could be. And so it's just, that's why Mary's so interesting, because you have, it's like a coin flip about how much did she know. Darren, I agree, definitely not completely innocent. No way. Knew something was going to happen. Enough evidence that something's going to happen. I think based on the evidence they had, even though there's questionable nature, when it comes down to what the verdicts were, even though I disagree with the death penalty, I'm very much against it in practice, even historically and stuff like that. When you look at what they did for these people on trial, the four we've talked about tonight, the evidence is that they knew about the assassination before it happened and did nothing to stop it. And that's what that earned them the noose, as opposed to, sorry, my phone's making noises.
That's okay.
As opposed to the other four who they couldn't prove that. They knew about the abduction and stuff like that. And so whether or not it was fair to execute them is a subject of debate. But I think as kangaroo courty as the military commission was, they were as fair as they could possibly be when it came to doling out punishments based on the evidence.
Yeah, and the litmus test to your point was whether or not you knew about the assassination or not. You can kind of expand this thing out. I know we're not going to talk about more people, but you look at, John Lloyd knew after the fact, certainly. Guys
the
like
people
Thomas,
who helped Booth,
right.
on the escape.
But guys like Thomas Jones, guys like that, right?
Yeah.
They clearly knew it because he was, in the pint they could bring in food, So you wonder where they drew the line, because they could have thrown a big net if they really, really wanted to.
And they claimed they were going, they arrested all of those people, and they were on the wanted poster. It says, death to anyone who aids and abets and stuff like that. So they threatened that. But I think in reality, they realized, first of all, we can't do that. Can you really get away from us, executing Thomas Jones helped a little bit, but all of these little people along the way, can we get away with it? And even Mudd, people like to be like, well, look what they did to Dr. Mudd. I'd be like, yeah, but look what Dr. Mudd did. I know we're not talking about him, but look what Dr. Mudd did in the months before. Exactly. That's why he doesn't fall in the same category as Thomas Jones. Because did he aid in a bed after? He sure did. But did he also help with the preparations? He absolutely did.
Exactly.
Well, you can make a case for Samuel Mudd that he knew that there was something going on. It's pretty unreasonable to think he knew about the assassination in real time.
I agree.
So in his mind, I don't buy the fact that he heard a knock on the door and he's, because of his oath, he had to. I don't buy it. I think he knew who it was, but he probably didn't know what Booth had done.
Sure.
But he also got him the hell out of Dodge pretty quick too.
Yeah, exactly.
He sent him on his way.
Yeah.
Sent him off with Herold, so he knew he must have been something.
And then he lied to the authorities, which is what did him in. His own lawyer said if they would, he denied knowing Booth, and then it wasn't until after he was arrested he's like, oh, I know John Wilkes Booth. It's like, dude, what did you think was going to happen?
Them to, wasn't he the reason Surratt and Booth met?
People who love Mary, you should hate Dr. Mudd. Because if Dr. Mudd didn't exist, Mary would have been alive.
No, I've never been a fan of Dr. Mudd.
But the Mudd House is great. Go visit his house.
Oh, I know. The Mudd House is great. And growing up, all I heard from my grandmother was, if you do that, your name will be Mudd, which I know is not really it's apparently not connected with him.
It is now. That's the way I see it.
She told me it was, but I'm like, why do you keep saying that? And she's like, do you know who Dr. Mudd is?
It's the same way Hooker is with Joe Hooker now. It's the same deal.
Yeah, exactly.
It is now. Now you can say.
Yeah. But that's what my grandma always told me it was Dr. Mudd. And I'm like, okay. All right.
I'm glad that made its way up to, and I can't say I've ever heard anyone use it in real life other than when I'm talking about this stuff.
So my grandma used it with me all the time. If I was doing something that could potentially get me into trouble, she was like, you keep doing that, your name will be Mudd. And I'm like, who's Mudd? And she was
just like squishy dirt.
And she's like, no, Dr. Mudd. And I'm like, oh, okay.
No, it's an interesting area. He's a kind of a cool grave to visit too. When you go down there to the church.
At the church where he met Booth.
No, it's interesting. It's that whole area is really, really neat down there. But I think the whole sordid tale is interesting, though. The movie we referenced earlier, that was kind of based on Larson's book there, is interesting too. The Conspirator, because we'll have her on for the book club, David. I think hopefully you're going to join us. That'll be a great time. It does show, and I think everybody who studies this should see the movie. It's not the most thrilling movie of all time.
Really. I love that movie.
But it's a good movie if you're into this. It's a good courtroom drama.
Yeah.
But if there aren't too many 16-year-old kids who are going to sit down and love this one. It's just
when I was 16, movie. I totally would have been.
But of course, I'm like this the whole time.
Oh, me too.
I will say, and I think Kate Cover Larson brings it up too, is this in the movie, Frederick Aiken who's played by James McAvoy.
Yeah.
It's all about it's about him. More so than it's about Mary, but it's mostly about him.
Yeah.
And they make him seem really good. He was the worst attorney there.
Oh, he was bad.
He was really bad in questioning and doing this thing. He was kind of a rookie. He was asking questions he didn't know the answers to, and just like calling witnesses that were not relevant. Not a good attorney. But in the movie, just like Hollywood magic. Well, it's James McAvoy. Yeah, look at him fighting for justice. This system. And my only critique is that I understand the criticisms that you put toward, that people put toward Edwin Stanton and just the entire commission and everything like that. And I'm not saying that Stanton wasn't involved in the goings on of the court and stuff like that, but I shy away from people who really dislike Stanton because not because I don't really care for him, but only because it puts all of the badness on one man, which I don't think is fair.
We are not
I don't really
Team
care for
Stanton here, just to let you know.
Well, I don't yeah. Go ahead, Jay.
It's way more than this. It's mostly because of the war aspect of it all, too.
Yeah.
I mean, he manipulated Lincoln, him and Halleck, and that's a different podcast. The only problem I had with this one was Kevin Kline playing him, by the way.
You didn't like him?
I thought he did good.
I didn't.
I will watch Kevin Kline in anything.
Oh, me too. I thought he did great.
But he was a little too fish called Wanda, a little too Dave for me. I like him, but I thought John.
You wanted a little more Wild Wild West?
John Goodman.
Oh, I loved him in Wild Wild West.
Wild Wild West.
Yes.
That was pretty good. Although Evan Rachel Ward, I'll watch that. I'll watch her with the phone book. I'll not go out. but
she was good. She was really good too.
You can't have Milton from Office Space playing John
Well,
Ward.
it's too bad you couldn't have had the Stanton from the National Geographic documentary Killing Lincoln, who looked like that movie was spot on cast. That's another one that I've mentioned a couple times in this. It's
great.
Not really connected with the Bill O'Reilly.
As you've been on
Real Twitter to talk about that, it is an excellent.
They did not use Bill O'Reilly's book at all to do it, which is why it's great.
So good. And I've had people like, I don't want to watch it because I think it's It's not Bill O'Reilly. It is.
Right.
They used the gentleman who wrote the book John Wilkes Booth Day by Day. His name was Art Lukes, and he was the one who did it. And his book is great, and that's why the documentary is wonderful. Yeah,
it is so
poorly
good.
named, but wonderful.
Exactly, it is so good. And I thought like the guy that played Booth did really good, and I thought like Billy Campbell, who was Lincoln, was great too. Like I thought it was so well cast and so well done. And it's another one next to The Conspirator that I would, after you've listened to this episode, watch them both.
That's right.
What was interesting, all four of these people we talked about, they all go to the gallows, and it's almost like they're all going on a different path. Mary, the whole "don't let me fall" line. Have the whole, to your point about with Powell saying, the captain,
best captain.
Best captain. And the sad part about Powell is he didn't die too quick.
He was the one that lived the
8
longest.
minutes to die. You wonder, all four of these guys, what went through their minds at the very end, if they realized they followed just a false leader that went down the wrong road. Because like we said before, these aren't people who were just hired guns. These are people who all had their own lives. I think as people study them individually, what's great about talking about them is it humanizes them a little bit. It shines light on them. Because when you talk about the Lincoln conspiracy, of course, you're going to talk about Booth, and that's all most people are going to talk about. But the people who helped and embedded him along the way all have their own stories. And I think people don't realize that there's good stories to tell.
Yeah. And I think it's about, you watch documentaries about it on TV and they really make them into villains and stuff. And like what they did was wrong, but it's about the lives that they had before too, what led them to this. We're talking about George Atzerodt, who had, at the time, Edith probably would have been about 3 or 4 years old. These are sons, their fathers, their siblings,
mothers
of people, exactly, mothers who are, ultimately in the end trying to protect their children. Mary probably was trying to protect John in some way. And I think when you look at these people and you humanize them, it's going to help you understand the whole Lincoln conspiracy a little bit more and the history behind it.
Yeah, because Booth, he's the villain, and he should be. He deserves to be the villain.
Absolutely.
And even though he's interesting, has his own stuff, and we can talk about him, I kind of prefer the conspirators because they speak more to us as everyday individuals.
Exactly.
And the path that we can choose, that we can make, seemingly for good reasons, for a cause we believed in the terms of Lewis Powell, for money, for some way to support our family in the case of like George Atzerodt, for accepting, finding a group of people who believe in you and trust you, like Davy Herold, or Mary, that's still, why did she do it? Well, she wanted to help her son, help a cause, and to what degree her guilt is there, that you have good intentions. I mean, you say that the path to hell is paved in good intentions. but they are the cautionary tale. At Booth, it's hard to associate ourselves. We look at Booth and be like, I'm not a famous actor who goes nuts and shoots the president.
Mm-hmm.
But these individuals, they weren't crazy. Booth wasn't either, but they were just normal people like you and me. And that is why most people don't like, in my mind, to study this stuff, is because it's too close to home. It's easy to discount Booth and the conspirators as bad in every way, bad people who do bad things. And it makes us feel better as society to know there's the good and there's the bad. But we know it's not true. We know it's not. And this is an example of, these are individuals who did bad things. Absolutely. They took part in one of the greatest crimes in American history, and we still feel the repercussions today. But they weren't inherently bad or evil people.
Mm-hmm.
It was the choices they made. And it's hard for people a lot of times to judge that, especially when you have Lincoln on the other side.
Exactly.
Lincoln, who we need to revere.
How he's been kind of like, it's like he gets elevated in all this, which he probably was the greatest president. He was a great human. But at that, is it right that we take these people down into being just, the worst to balance it out, just, these one-dimensional figures who were absolute demons? It's sometimes like they just appear on April 14th and they disappear when they're executed. And I think to understand the full story, to understand even Lincoln's presidency, you have to study them as people as well, and to understand what their motives were, why they did it. Even though we disagree with it. Exactly. They made those choices. Exactly. They made those choices. We have to learn from them and figure out why they did it. Otherwise, Lincoln's death is hollow. And that's my biggest thing I've always said whenever people ask why I study this, because it seems like it's the bad guy. It's the sad ending to Lincoln, the great emancipator and everything. Why would you spend so much time on this? Because it gives meaning to Lincoln's death. Without it, when we just give him the caricatures of crazy Confederate actor and a bunch of bad people, then it's hollow. His death means nothing at that point, because it just shows but when you put it in context of the greater picture, what motivated each of these people, it helps show his impact on everyone. Just even the nobodies like George Atzerodt or, like David Herold, like that Lincoln had such an impact on them that they would work towards this thing of killing him, shows, it explains Lincoln's importance in his own time, even from the people who hated him. And if we just discount Booth and the conspirators, we lose a central part of who Lincoln was in his own time. Exactly. No, 100% agree with that.
Well, it's definitely, it's easier historically to look at Booth as the Pescara from the apostate, right? To look at that. The only guy who could kill a president like Lincoln had to be the epitome of evil, right? In that's the way the whole mindset goes. And so you have to, it's the seesaw. It's got to be one or the other. So it's easy, I think, conceptually in our minds, put your arms around it that way, than to look at these people as complex individuals. Because when you humanize them, you want them to be anything but human. And I think that's why people don't like to study them. Why people don't like to even say his name. Mm-hmm. Right, because it's important to look at this, because once we stop humanizing people, I'm not sure what we're all doing here. That's what we have to do. Yeah, exactly. There's a fear to see and I mean, there is a legitimate fear to see parts of ourselves in these figures, and that makes us uncomfortable. And so we refuse it by making them two-dimensional, just flat characters. But when you really look into it, it's not that you agree in anything, but when you see the human side of it, it's uncomfortable for us. But we need to, in all history, to see, especially when we look at the villains, not because we agree with them, but to see what was the human element that led them to what they did. Exactly. Yeah. Well, I think it was a good discussion. We could drop it off here, I think. Yep. But it's a great talk to do all this stuff. And I could talk about this all night. Oh, me too. Hopefully the three of us can get together sometime and talk about this over like some drinks at the Walk and Roll. That's right. Yeah. And Mary's going to show off her karaoke skills. Oh, yeah. Oh. We'll see. That would be I'll tell you right now, that'll be the worst disaster ever to happen in that building. Trust me. Wow. Rough. If that happens. Ooh. You don't want that happening. Mary, you should slap him. Is that a challenge? Trust me, the worst thing ever to happen in that city. I'm telling you right now. She does karaoke. But I think two of you, islands in the stream. Anyway, yep. Sorry. Oh, absolutely. God. Oh, good. Old school right there. That's just, back in my parents' car, sitting in the back of the seat with the no seatbelts rolling around, But again, it's great to talk about this stuff too, because you know what though, in normal lives, we all have our own regular lives. We don't get to talk about this stuff. Yeah. We just don't get a chance. We get funny looks when we do. No, exactly. What do you think was going through George Atzerodt's mind? sorry, sir, this is the Taco Bell drive-through, you know.
Yeah, right.
but I think you study the stuff and you get to learn a lot about it. And I think the more you study this, the more it gives you a greater you learn about Lincoln more by studying this.
Exactly.
And that's the thing that I've come across is how much more you learn about Abraham Lincoln based on the Lincoln assassination.
Yeah.
I think it's hand in hand. You can't tell the story of Lincoln without telling the story of Booth. I think you just have to do it.
Yep. And it factors into the story of the Civil War as well, how divided the country was, how passionate some people were about the Confederacy. You know, you look at John Wilkes Booth, and he's somebody that, you know, the fall of Richmond was probably what made him switch from kidnapping to assassination. Like, well, if I'm going to watch my country die, then by God, the man that made it die is going to go down with it too. I think that's how he felt about it. And that, and, you know, as you said, Dave, the vanity behind it as well. He was very disillusioned at that point, and it all factors into this story that is the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And you have to look at all of it.
You'll never know what struggles they had too, what was going through their minds. Even Booth, for example,
Yep.
of what he wrestled with. But again, it's part of history, and it's something everybody should study. Definitely should not be something to be afraid of. It's something to embrace and look at and get a better picture, a better appreciation for the 16th president, at minimum, no question.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, hey, Dave, thanks for jumping on with us. And
Thanks for letting me join you. It was fun.
Well, you're
awesome.
welcome back anytime.
Yeah,
Definitely welcome back anytime.
like, I think you'll probably be joining us again for another discussion.
Sounds good. Yeah, we got 4 of the conspirators who are on trial, and 1 more who came later. So I'm just
saying. Yeah.
We can do the whole Michael Laughlin story next time.
Oh, it's fascinating. You know he was a quilter? I'll tell you that next time.
Well, I think we definitely have to make that happen sometime then.
Oh, it'd be a lot of fun. No question about that. So anyway, thanks for joining us, Dave. It's been a great time. So this will drop on Saturday morning, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Kate's book club.
Yes, looking forward
to talk about that. So now you got to read the book again.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to having to read it again. But yeah, and I love all of Kate Clifford Larson's books, so it's gonna be great.
Nice, she's great to do. So in any case, we appreciate you doing it. This is a lot of fun, Mary. As always, the pleasure was all yours. Like I say all the time. And well.
I was about to say, thanks for, a full year of this. You've been an awesome co-host.
Full year of this.
Yeah. She's getting that Lizzie Borden look in her eye right now. But in any case, again, this is a great time. So we'll definitely look forward to this. We'll definitely have you on again soon. We've been looking to have you on for a long time. So I'm glad we finally connect, and hope you enjoy Texas.
Yeah, the land of the Booth mummy.
Yep.
There you go. Make sure you go to 6th Street too. Make sure she lets you out and go to 6th Street, because good restaurants. A lot of places avoiding getting in trouble on 6th Street. So
okay, so I'm not allowed there.
Probably not.
Darren, I doubt if you would be allowed there.
I had a great time on 6th
He's got a reputation. He's not allowed back.
I've been to 6th Street. 6th Street's fantastic. It's a great time. So we look forward to talking to you soon. Again, we appreciate you jumping on with us. We always love talking about old JWB and the gang, and we'll look forward to doing this again. We will absolutely do this again, talk more depth with some of the other guys, and maybe talk about the other 5 we never get a chance to talk about.
Yeah, I think we definitely will. So to all our listeners, thank you for this is our 1-year anniversary. We were happy to have Dave Taylor join us. Follow him at Lynn Conspirators on Twitter, and he's on Instagram too. Follow him on there. He's a great follow. Anyway, so Darren, thank you for being the awesome co-host that you are for these last 52 episodes. You and your bobblehead there. Anyway, until next week, when we will be back with you talking about the Battle of Richmond, Kentucky. So we are headed back to, I guess, Western Theater again. Facebook Live is always Saturday at 10 a.m. And until next time, we will see you all again soon.
Peace out.
Bye, guys.
Sic Semper Tyrannis.